Hello, Diego.
Hello. Sorry,
How are you?
because fine, and you?
Yeah, fine. I
Sorry.
mean,
Yeah.
not sure all of us are fine.
Sorry, I was late, but I was finishing cleaning the dishes, washing the dishes. So yeah, now I'm here.
We saw each other. We are neighbors, kinda.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Mm. So what will I do? I will try to share my screen now, so you'll see slides actually.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, let's see. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Do you see me as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I was hoping that you would. Okay, so today we are proceed with our reading of Zizek post-traumatic subject, the paper which all of you read, I'm sure. And so I'll present you my line of reading, what is important for me and the way I develop my thoughts while basing on this. And also from the next seminar, Angelina will present her line of thought also with slides, and we will discuss it more in detail. And the second half of the lecture is actually a lecture which was planned for week 7, is a lecture on consciousness, but those are the post-traumatic subject and the theory of consciousness are actually super connected, so there's supposed to be no problem that everything which is traumatic is connected to each other. Consciousness is traumatic and subject is traumatic, so for this class it will do. So what's the problem? What is Zizek's problem with Malabou? He claims that, as you know, that Malabou is doesn't see what is already present in psychoanalysis. So she claims that with this destructive plasticity she is talking about, that Freud and psychoanalysis and Lacan, they actually failed to conceptualize it, that it's not present in psychoanalysis. And she is the one who is figuring out how to present it, how to make it a part of the discourse. But Zizek claims that what Malabou is looking for is already present in psychoanalysis, in Freud, and in Lacan. And so her criticism is not completely correct. And I don't agree with, I mean, to a certain degree, I agree with both, but to a certain degree, I don't. And Zizek claims that this destructive plasticity, the destructive plasticity that makes forms out of destruction, that has formative power of destruction, is actually present structurally and is the basic principle of psychoanalysis. It constitutes, so Malabou, following Freud in a way, looking for it, for this destructive plasticity somewhere outside of a pleasure principle, but for Zizek it's already not outside, beyond pleasure principle. But for Zizek it's already present constitutively within the pleasure principle. It's something about its inherent internal problematicity, its internal structure of the very pleasure principle. So it's supposed to, according to Zizek, we're supposed to look inside the pleasure principle. It's still a basic principle in a way, but, and this is where we'll find this destructive plasticity, what Malabou is defines as destructive plasticity. So there is this distinction in psychoanalysis that Lacan introduces between pleasure and what he calls jouissance. It's a very important, crucial term for psychoanalysis. And jouissance, actually it translates from French as a pleasure, and sometimes refers to sexual pleasure. So jouissance, Lacan defines as already the pleasure that already includes pain, and the pain already includes pleasure. So we can see it as a, well, in a way, dialectic of pleasure principle, because everything which is the simple definition is that everything which is painful, to deal with it, we need to kind of feel pleasure of it, and On the contrary, we know how to feel pleasure. Yeah, we know how to feel pleasure in a pain. For example, the ascetic tendencies that we restrain from pleasure, and this gives us pleasure. And on the contrary, the pleasure is painful because it's not never enough. We were talking about the examples and Zizek was telling us about the example on the video, about the example that if the husband will get what he wants with his mistress, and his wife will disappear. I think in his example, she will die. He will not be happy anyway, because once we get when we get in something we really want, the next stage is that we are unhappy because it's not what we actually wanted. And the other thing is that desire can never be fully satisfied. It's always the satisfaction gives us pain, or the other interpretation that we always need more, it's never enough. So something like that. This Jouissance presupposes that there is already the pleasure principle. We want pleasure, but we can never get pleasure. This very principle is a principle of destructive plasticity. There is a pain within the pleasure and pleasure within the pain. And kind of this jouissance, the term jouissance, they capture both pleasure and pain. And Zizek refers to the pleasure that becomes pain, this aspect of jouissance. It actually refers to what Malabou calls the new wounded, those products or creatures of the destructive plasticity produces. So they can be described by the new wounded, by the term new wounded. And so again, Zizek claims that death drive is already a primal principle in Freud because of this internal structure of because it's inherently present in a death drive, in the in a pleasure principle. So death drive is not something that that is opposite to a pleasure principle, but it's constitutive inherent element. So here's the quote. Zizek, relying on Deleuze, claims that eros and thanatos, so the eros that represents pleasure principle and thanatos that represents death drive, are not two opposites that complete and combine their forces. There is only one drive, libido, our need for enjoyment, so this pleasure principle, but death drive is the carved space of its formal structure. It plays the role of transcendental principle, why the pleasure principle is only psychological. So in this sense, he kind of at the same time preserves, Zizek preserves the pleasure principle as a main principle, but at the same time, because the death drive is inherently present in it, and it defines the inner structure of a pleasure principle, we can claim that it's the main principle. So here we see that death drive is transcendental, somewhere, or something that is basic in a way, something that defines the pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle is only psychological. So they exist in kind of a different dimension. The one which is more important here is transcendental dimension. So in transcendental dimension, it's a death drive, the general principle, but in a psychological embodiment of this principle, we have a pleasure principle, striving for pleasure. Also, Laplanche and Pantalis, they also claim that what is designed here by death drive is more than any particular type of instinct, is the actual principle of all instincts. So this is the way human beings are not created, generated. That the way the death drive exists, it defines. It's also all the rest of the drives are structured by the same by the same principle. So he refers to Lacan here, Zizek in his criticism of Malabou. Zizek disagrees that Freud fails to consider the existence of specific forms of psyche produced by presence of death and of pain. He claims that this is what, by pleasure principle, define human beings as those who follow the pleasure principle. Freud actually already defined them as something that is, as someone, as those creatures who are defined by a death drive. And he refers to Lacan, claiming that in Lacan, Lacan was trying to reinterpret Freudian thought within psychoanalysis. Lacan claims that the subject already initially, human being, the human is the subject who continues to live after his physic death. And for example, this Lacanian subject, the cross S, he signed for a subject, or the bird subject, as it's called. For Lacan, the reality, or the real, which is real, is more than reality. But so this real, this transcendental principle of our existence, it's already incoherent with itself. There is already a crack within it, and the way we feel this real, we feel it through anxiety. We feel it when we are traumatized. So we are kind of closer to this real when we feel an anxiety, kind of non-coincidence of it with itself. So for Lacan, a subject as such, within the evolution or within the individual history, it appears as absent subject, as cross subject, as a dead subject. It's always a second birth of a subject. And for this reason, every trauma that we encounter in our life, every trauma is a second trauma in comparison to this initial trauma that defines a subject as such. It's always the memory of the initial trauma. So trauma is the basis of formation of a subject for Lacan. It's also the other way to interpret it that Zizek uses is that we never coincides with the story that we tell ourselves. So there is always, there is this memory about who we are, but we can also, we know that memories are, for example, modifiable from current sounds. So there's, if they're modifiable, or if we have new memories and we form our new features, so what is this that forms all of it? It's kind of the absence that is the absence that it's doesn't coincide with the self, doesn't coincide with the stories, the memories, autobiographical memories that we tell ourselves. So we start with the absence, and we already present as the absence. And whenever we have this trauma, the intrusion from some violent experience, the intrusion of the way Lacan and Zizek call it, of the real, of reality, which is harsh. Some, as we remember from Freud, the trauma, some new, radically new experience that we can't use to create a coherent whole with previous experience. And this is why we are traumatized, because we feel that we are this empty someone inside, that we lose this coherence, and this incoherence, the absence of coherence, the absence of our memory as a whole, is the basis of a subject. And it's so the destructive, and paradoxically we are closer to this experience of reality when we lose ourselves, when we lose our memories, when we feel this internal rupture. So when something happened and we don't want to remember it, when it's hard for us to remember it, to keep it in mind, this is because it's not us. We don't want it to be us. And it also tells us that, points that there is no us, and that anything can happen and we don't know who we are. And Lacan defines it as the human being. This quote is man, as always. So in men, but also in all the genders, there is already a crack, a profound perturbation of the regulation of life. And that's the importance of the notion introduced by Freud of the death drive. So again, we see that the human being starts from the crack, starts from this trauma, starts from its absence. And it's all, and this absence, trauma, crack, non-coincidence with itself, is a basis of a subject. It was what destroys us, because it's our absence. And it also something that generates us, because we are nothing, we are initially this absence. We can actually modify our memories, we can actually change. And this is the death drive. This is the death drive at the beginning, at the basis of a subject. Slavoj Žižek claims that trauma emerges when the living individual is deprived of its substantial content, and this constitutive trauma is repeated in a present traumatic experience. So it's, again, different logic, not like in psychology, popular psychology, and in psychiatry, and even in neurology, that there is the trauma is a deviation, and the normal flow of life of a subject is what we never encounter trauma, including in childhood, including at the beginning, when it's all coherent and actually heal all the deviations. And once we heal them, the subject will coincide with himself, will be non-traumatic at all. This is the image that we currently have. But according to psychoanalysis, according to this logic, and I will later show that not only to this logic from within psychoanalysis, but also in contemporary neurobiology, we can find the other perspective that I support, that the trauma is constitutive, right? We can, the trauma functions maybe like a transcendental principle, but I don't like this word because it implies that there is some well, I don't like the metaphysics. I think we can think about it outside of without using metaphysical terms. So it's something that defines the main basic principle is this death drive, destruction, destructive plasticity, and but something that is added to it, the psychological principle, and the way we can see it from our point of view, that it can be claimed that we strive for happiness, we want to be happy, but we can never actually be totally happy, because totally satisfied, feel only pleasure, because we won't be ourselves, because the trauma is something that defines it. And yeah, if we imagine, for example, as the Leontiev example from debate, that we don't actually perceive, even though we have this ideal of human being as totally happy and satisfied, and this is what we have to strive for as a society, as an individual, the easiest way to attain this kind of eternal pleasure is to use drugs, right? Because you get because of the chemical reaction, you get joy as a result. But we don't perceive, we still see that there's something wrong with the human being, that this is the person who is detached from reality, and we still consider that we need to rescue those kind of people. So at the same time, maybe we have this idea that we're supposed to be happy, but at the same time, even on the level of everyday thinking, we understand that that this principle exists, that it will just mean that we are detached from reality and we lose in our consciousness. So again, Žižek is very happy that Malabou is doing what she's doing, trying to conceptualize, well, in his interpretation is reconceptualize the notion of subject, so that it will include this destructive plasticity, this subject of the zero level of subject as a zero level of a death drive. But he claims, as I told you, that already, and as you know, that it's already present in psychoanalysis. And I agree and disagree with both. So to understand this kind of Žižek thinking and the way his reinterpretation of Freud and of Lacan, we need to know what is Hegelian dialectic, because this is what what Zizek tries to combine with psychoanalysis. Initial understanding of a Hegelian dialectic is this. So you're supposed to know that, I guess. Traditional Hegelian dialectic, even though he never uses those terms, but this is the main thing now people are talking when in relation to Hegel. So according to his logic, there is a thesis, there is antithesis, something that contradicts, negation of thesis, and it end up in a synthesis. So do you have any examples of what can it be, how we can see this logic in the real world? So for example, the easiest example maybe is that thesis is that, synthesis is something that combines both the thesis and antithesis. It preserves this negation, and it's actually for what?
How is it possible to fuse thesis and antithesis if thesis and antithesis must be two opposite things?
Yeah, destroy each other. It's true.
Then how they create synthesis this way?
Yeah, and this is how this was Hegelian logic, and it was good in a way to describe certain things, right? And because we still exist, right? There's something that is negates the other thing, doesn't actually destroy the other thing, something that is opposite. But in real life, we don't have those opposites, right? So it was yeah, Zizek doesn't agree with this dialectics, and he tries to redefine. I'll show you later how, or you will show me later how. So for example of thesis and antithesis, the way he think of history and of other stuff, it's for example that there is a seed, the thesis, the seed of a flower. Then out of the seed, the flower grows, and the flower is not, the plant is not already, is antithesis because it's kind of opposite to a seed. It's not a seed anymore. And since, and it leads to synthesis, because they both are kind of subletted, they preserve, it's a both seed and a flower, and then something happens again. So
it's so strange.
It is strange, but it was very useful concept in the history of philosophy at certain time. The other example, the most popular one in terms of history that we have, the thesis is capitalism, the antithesis is socialism, it's something opposite, and synthesis is supposed to be communism. So like maybe from some perspective, something that we have now, socialism within the capitalism. We need to respect human rights, to aim for equality, but this actually preserves capitalism. And the other example is that, for example, the statement, we need to go to the bank to get money, is true, but antithesis is that we don't need to go to the bank to get cash money. And synthesis would be ATM, right? We go in to get money, we don't go to bank, we go to ATM because whatever. So this is this logic, but for this purpose, it doesn't work because, well, in terms of memories, of human memories and development of human being, like there is a coherent self, the thesis, me, there is some antithesis, the trauma, and we actually use this logic a lot in our understanding of everything. There is us with our coherent memories, coherent understanding of who we are, students of SAS or professor at SAS. There is antithesis, if something happened and suddenly we are not all of that. And the synthesis, it's, or for example, some trauma happens and we are, some destruction intrusion from reality that we can't comprehend, that is traumatic for us, that it's not us. For example, someone died, right? And we can't think ourselves as ourselves anymore. So antithesis is something that destroys us. And synthesis, the psychology would think it that we kind of overcoming it at this state. We are compensating. So it's new us that that includes both of our experience. The experience that we used to be that we used to be a person who lived with other person who was close to us, that we used to be students of SAS or professor of SAS, and there is plus this traumatic experience, and there is new us, right? Again, coherent. Okay, so what was Zizek's problem with it? He claimed that in a whole this logic, in a whole this dialectical, there is no space for destructive plasticity, for the total rupture, for the 0 point, for the absence. There is something that tries to destroy something, and then there is this, they sublet each other, and they kind of, there is a combination of it, which is better, which is a progress and stuff like that. So there is no space for the 0 point, for the content that is radically erased, like in those, like as there is when as a result of destructive plasticity, when it's radical rupture, when the subject is, when a Gage, Phineas Gage is not Gage anymore, is someone else. There is no place to see this actual trauma, the trauma that we are not able to overcome, the trauma that will never be healed, and which actually, according to psychoanalysis, is at the basis of a subject. So this is something crucial that we need to think, not subject, but history as well, and everything, and even ATM, I think, to a certain extent. So this, within this dialectic, Hegelian dialectic, there is no space for this crucial thing, for the absence, for the radical destruction, for destructive plasticity. And to understand how Zizek tries to change, I think it's crucial in Zizek to get it. How Zizek tries to think Hegelian, Freudian, Lacanian, Hegel in a properly Freudian, Lacanian way, so include Hegel in psychoanalysis, is his famous principle of absolute recoil. So we start from zero, the movement that, something that moves and is based on the total rupture, on a trauma, on absence. We also, the easier way to understand it is Zizek usually always actually refers to Hobsbawm concepts of invented tradition. Do you know what is it? No. And why there are Slovenians national costumes out there? It's his example.
No.
Okay, good. It's not that weird. So yeah, it's easier to use the example of Slovenian national costumes there. So he likes the theory, Hobsbawm's theory of invented tradition, because he claims, and I promise there is a link with Hegel in all this. So traditions are always invented, according to Hobsbawm, even though we consider ourselves, our identity, national identity, we do research on our history, on our traditions, but at the same time, those traditions are invented. And for Zizek, the clear example was the Slovenian tradition, Slovenian costumes, when suddenly were invented at certain times of a history, and suddenly Slovenia started to recognize itself as something that exists within those traditions, as defined by those traditions before, and those costumes started to be popular. And we know this maybe because I'm from Ukraine. I know the same thing where the people started after the end of the Soviet Union. People started to invent Ukrainian history, Ukrainian traditions. Not that it wasn't there before, it was there. I mean, it is true those costumes actually existed, but nobody used them as a basis for the identity. There was no need to form this identity. Where people in the villages, they were wearing certain type of clothes, but nobody actually paid attention to it. Nobody used it as, you know, put somewhere on the pictures, make albums with all this stuff and create your identity on this basis. So we kind of, and this is the point of rupture, right? When we not only, again, the non-existence of the identity at the basis, because those traditions, the invention of traditions, we using them, we also invent not our future, not only identity of the future, but also our past. Yeah, also our past identity. So there's this point, the rupture, when we are creating this. The same with feminism. Not that there was no patriarchal order that was invented before the feminism. There was what feminists are talking about actually did existed, but nobody called it patriarchy. Nobody paid precise attention, because actually people were kind of fine with it before. Maybe not fine, but didn't actually see it from that point of view as a subject to change, as inequality. So at a certain time, the past changes, and it's not always, not only with good stuff, like, well, not sure traditions are good stuff, not only with feminism, but with a Nazi regime, like everything works when this, on this principle. Was suddenly the past changes, not only future, the way we define ourselves, but the past as well. And so we, at this point, we introduce a totally new past. And from the point of rupture, yeah, we are not ourselves anymore, and we truly believe, yeah, and there is kind of no future and no past outside of these processes. For example, with Nazi regime, we know that there was this idea of not only of new future, but also of a new past, some tradition that we have to follow, those better kind of people that used to exist in history, and we need to restore them at this certain stage. Same with religion. There is a God. There used to be Adam and Eve in heaven. So this is how we work, and it actually this bad stuff and the good stuff, which actually shows that we are, the basis is the rupture, the non-coincidence with ourselves, not non-coincidence of the story with ourselves, with the, yeah, well, with ourselves. And this is how we can actually invent, all of the stuff that we invent. So Hegelian logic and dialectic, the way he defines it, what I was going to do, I was going to give you stickers and ask you to draw the scheme of this Hegelian understanding of Zizek's understanding of Hegel's new dialectics, that it's not thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but how would we draw this new logic that goes through rupture, goes through emptiness. If you have, I can probably share a whiteboard with you, but it's going to be complicated. And if you have any ideas how to draw it, let me know. Do you? There is no way, no proper way. No, good, because I don't know how to do it too. And yeah, I'm not sure there is a way to make a drawing, because as Zizek claims, it's the movement of nothing to nothing and back to itself. Yes, so you can't draw nothing. You can put the dot in it and draw there is nothing, maybe with some arrows to another nothing, but you actually can't see it. And because it's nothing, let's come back to the slide with Hegelian dialectic. Because it's nothing, it's already present. Okay, this logic might work, yeah, as the maybe the pleasure principle, as the visible principle, psychological principle, but with the nothing is all over it, right? We just can't see it. This is the basic one. You know, we can change something because it's changeable, because it has this point where it doesn't coincide with itself. And so it's like you see nothing in it. So wherever you actually draw, it will be correct, because what is the most important is you can't draw it, and it's the basic one. It's the same principle with the death drive, right? We don't see it as a principle. I mean, the way Zizek defines it, We don't see it as a main principle. What we see is that we want pleasure, we're striving for pleasure, and once we can get enough and be happy, and the happy ending. But the real thing, the real transcendental thing underneath all of it, that there is this inherent rupture, inherent trauma, and the beginning is traumatic, and every change is traumatic. We can't see it, but still.
I have a challenging question.
Yeah.
Does it turns out that, for example, taking drugs, which considered to be not real pleasure, is actually the only real pleasure we can have, the only real happiness?
Yeah, soon I will probably we will have the recording of this debate, and we actually came to conclusion that there is no pleasure
Yeah.
at all, which I really like, because we might, I mean, no happiness, because we might feel something kind of like a pleasure when we are on drugs, but we actually on drugs, if you develop the dependence on drug, you actually still feel pain because you want more, and you only feel a relief when you're satisfied. So still the main continuum is kind of when you suffer, but at the same time it's not a real happiness. So this is not what we call in everyday language a real happiness, the happiness of someone who uses drug. This is not what we want. It's not that hard to, or do you?
And what we call real happiness?
Well, we came to conclusion that there is no happiness. I mean, because in the end starts with rupture, because there are many ways you can define it, and they contradict each other, so it doesn't exist. Okay, so what Zizek talks here, we need to talk about consciousness too. So Zizek arguments with Malabou. Again, we're talking about that of course Malabou understands that the new subject arises out of nothing. It still preserves many traces of the former subjectivity. So even though in our life, the way we know it, we feel that we coincide with ourselves, we feel that our stories about us is us, so they're part of us. And so when Malabou is talking, and even her grandmother with Alzheimer's disease, it's still at least someone is understand that it's her, even it's still her, maybe radically changed, but there is still this rupture that we don't see, maybe we don't want to see, and it's internal rupture that actually defines the subject. And this is the rupture Malabou is talking about, that when we are not ourselves, the radically new subjects. And those new traces are totally restructured, turned out of the previous horizon of meaning and inscribed into a new context. The new subject goes through rupture. So again, same like with those traditions, we can see the coherence of invented traditions. They're always invented. We can see the coherence of the history through those traditions, but at the same time, their appearance, the inner principle, that it was a total rupture. Some point where the non-coincidence was discovered, and then the coherence came to mask the non-coincidence. So we'll have the impression of coherence again. And this process is at the basis of not only those who suffer from destructive plasticity, not only people with Alzheimer's disease or other groups of people who we define as products of destructive plasticity, but actually as a human being as such. Again, Zizek criticized all of those who he calls humanists, for example, Sachs and other humanists. He claimed that those neurologists and psychiatrists who he claimed that make their work simple, working within the perspective that there was a coherent, healthy human being, then something happened, some kind of neurological disorder, and what they see, they don't see the inner traumaticity. They only see they only talk about healing, this idea of healing, that we can proceed with our normal, the plasticity in the way we normally understand it, and develop some compensation. And this is how psychiatry actually works. And I'm not sure it will be able, because it defined, it's based on the idea of healing, and it's a good thing. But it doesn't comprehend, within this perspective, we don't comprehend this internal mechanics that it can't be healed. We are the trauma. So that part of, I think, philosophy is supposed to do that. Otherwise, the idea of healing might be kind of corrupted here. So my objections here are, well, why Jouissance, right? I'm here with Malabou, who claimed that psychoanalysis is not able to capture this the death drive as a basic principle, because, okay, we're talking about Jouissance as something that includes pain and pleasure, but Jouissance, the very word, is translated, it means the joy, it means the pleasure itself. So no matter how you claim now, because of this term, no matter how you claim that the pain is included in here, what we see, the main term is, the main thing is jouissance. And that's why I like the term destructive plasticity, and I think it's better than this, because this one needs further explanation. And no matter how you try to justify yourself that it includes pain, that it ends with a pain, and that pleasure is a pain or pain is a pleasure, all of those, still the very word is bad. And Malabou is correct in this thing. You can't go beyond the pleasure principle if you call it pleasure. So destructive plasticity is something new and more radically better. And the other possible objection, that for Malabou, destructive plasticity creates monsters, and she doesn't use the term monster the way I use it, that all of us are monsters and zombies. And the way Gigi calls us the autistic subject, not us, maybe other people. So for all of them, they still, no matter that they see that it's the basic of a human being, that it's the main principle, they still manage to, Malabou still managed to see this, those who are the products of destructive plasticity as a certain group of people. Yeah, and delineated, separated from normal, healthy people, even though they claim that it's at the basic of every subject, but still they manage to see it. They don't see what they see sometimes, and they manage to separate them in a group and talk from the perspective that they are healthy, and they are those who define others as well, Zizek claims sometimes that he doesn't do psychoanalysis because he is not that healthy psychologically, but still, the very position where we delineate people, that someone is a group and the product of destructive plasticity, means that it's not us. You're supposed to talk about yourself, first of all. I never talked about myself as a destructive plasticity, but as a product. But so, I am too, and all of you are, especially today. So, yeah, the destructive plasticity as a basic principle, and it's better to think of it as just maybe the different levels of destructive plasticity, how closer we are coincide with who we really are with our traumatic core self. Because the closer we coincide, the more traumatized we are, or the less we are capable to mask it with the pleasure principle, something, whatever. So better to think it as of a degree, but maybe there are different degree, like in Freud, idea that we all hysterical, but to different degree, and certain degree are just okay for our life within the culture. So degree is better, but maybe there is other way which is even better, not degree, not the group, but something else. So consciousness. The new name for us, if you read this part from Parallax U, is Antonio Damasio, and Malabou talks a lot about him. Zizek talks as well about him. He is a neuroscientist. He studies contemporary neuroscientists. He studies brain processes that underlies emotions, decision making, and consciousness. Some of his books most referred to as Descartes' error, emotion, reason, and the human brain, and self comes to mind, constructing the conscious brain. So if you read it, you know, Zizek is talking about this basic structure, that at the bottom, what appears first is proto-self, it's a non-conscious level, then core self, and then outer biological self. So what are those? The proto-self at the bottom, which comes first, is something that most of the animals share. It's not the conscious state yet. It appears in a evolution as a basic state, there's something that precedes consciousness. And it's a mechanism of regulating how our brain, basic structure of brain, regulates our, Damasio claims, Zizek supports him, how it maintains our homeostasis. So how to understand it? For example, if someone threatens the homeostasis, the normal coherent state of organism, it kind of, we don't like it, the organism doesn't like it, and it goes through some changes, so it reacts on it. And if it likes it, it just, for example, to eat, yeah, the organism eat, and this is how it preserves its homeostasis. So there is this basic proto-self that helps us to maintain the homeostasis. It reacts kind of as a like or dislike, something that is that helps to regulate it. Then appears the core self. This is quote from Zizek, who quotes Damasio. A second order non-verbal, so there is no language here, account that occurs whenever an object modifies the proto-self. So the core self, something that precedes our autobiographical self, is the consciousness of this consciousness, the consciousness of a proto self. Yeah, initially it was a reaction on an outside processes. The organism needs to evaluate those processes, kind of not evaluate yet, but react on them to preserve homeostasis. And then the core self appears as a capability, as a consciousness of this basic consciousness, of this basic reaction. So Zizek claims this the other word, but we can think of it as a glitch, right? We're not only reacting to the outside, to some processes, but we also reacting to this very reaction. We are conscious of this basic stuff that reacts on the outside processes. If it's cold, if it's hot, if it's someone is destroying us. So the proto-self is something that is shared by by all of the animals, that they need to react on the outside to preserve themselves. But core self is not, most of the animals, many animals have it, but not all of them. So autobiographical self, the human self, is the implicit, it's already memories that form from the core self. When we have this consciousness of our reactions, from this glitch, we can actually form the memories of what happened from the memories of our past, and form the anticipated future, because the future works in the same way as the memories. We just have formed some information. And the other thing important to understand, what Damasio is famous for in his book Against Descartes, he writes that this is counterintuitive, because from Descartes, and even now in neuroscience, even now in our everyday thinking, we think that emotions are something that contradicts rationality. So emotions is something which is bad for rationality, that we need to clean our mind from emotions and will be totally reasonable. But because consciousness, we think, is not emotional. For Damasio, he as a neurobiologist and also evolutionary biologist, neurobiologist, he claims that consciousness is emotional, that all of those within evolution, all of those parts of brain that that are responsible for the proto-self, the core self, autobiographical self. So initial emotions, I like it, I don't like it, it's bad for me, I don't want it, it's good for me. Something that we need for preservation, to preserve ourselves. He called it markers. We actually, every other layer the newer layer that appears on the brain of animals later in evolution, it's based on the initial core consciousness. I mean, this initial core structure. For example, something that reacts, these basic reactions, emotional, I like it, I don't like it, I feel fear, for example, because it's bad for me, I want to regulate my homeostasis. This we can't get rid of it because it's basic, right? And so we can't preserve only the neocortex, the latest structure that is humans have, and it's something we associate with thinking, because it's based on the initial structure. It's a reflection of initial structure. It's more complicated variant. It's still I like and I don't like it, but more complicated, or maybe more complicated in terms that there is this glitch and we actually reacting on this and form memory based on this. So this is why we can still have troubles regulating our emotions. And yeah, the first is the reptilian brain, so-called, at the basis. If we switch it off, the neocortex won't work, we just won't be conscious. And the next structure is limbic brain, that is something that responsible for more sophisticated emotions, and the neocortex that we associate with the with thinking. So that's my favorite part from Zizek, the Parallax You, his chapter on Damasio. Zizek claims that Damasio leaves out of consideration the proper empty core of subjectivity within. So even though he Zizek managed to write, to find this Lacanian idea of the, not only Lacanian idea of the empty subject, of a subject as absence in Damasio, he still claims, Zizek claims that Damasio doesn't pay enough attention to it, doesn't consider that this is empty. And so you will read it if you haven't read it yet, and he will explain, Zizek will explain it better. But again, within this structure, yet there is no self. The self is a kind of a glitch, kind of non-coincidence with the proto-self, and maybe even a mistake in the way. So there is a second order reflection of the initial reflection of this proto-self. And there is the way we think it, and the way we intuitively probably think it, that there is homunculus inside of us, there's some tiny person inside of us who actually controlling our body, and this is our consciousness, but there is no one there, right? There is just this glitch, the second order registration of initial non-conscious registration, and there, if you go behind it, there is no one who is looking at you, so there is no self. So again, like in a Hegelian structure, there is thesis, antithesis, wherever, but still the most important one is invisible and is absent, something that defines this structure, some non-coincidence, some absence. The same with the self, so it's just no one there. If you want to think about yourself, you just think, you're doing thinking, and there is no one who is thinking, right? So it's no self. Self only exists while you think about the self, because we are the glitch. Well, not only we are, but the very function of a consciousness. There is no one there. And the other idea he develops, that not only the empty core of subjectivity, is that he tries to show, Zizek tries to show that it coincides with Freudian death drive. Also, he mentions Feuerbach, and also he mentions Hegelian idea of night of the world. So all of those destructive things are at the bottom of a subject, and we can see it from the Damasio scheme. So he claims here at the end that from when the core self actually detaches itself from its initial environment, when everything worked normally, kind of, when it was aimed at preservation of homeostasis, like those normal program of survival that helps the organism to survive. The consciousness, the more developed consciousness, appears as a rupture of this immersion, yeah, as the rupture of a self that doesn't exist from its environment. So it's And because Damasio shows this connection with thinking, rationality, consciousness, and emotions or feelings, he actually distinguishes those. And Gege claimed that it's actually the formation of a consciousness is painful. The first thing that comes, the first feeling is anxiety and horror. This is how the appearance of a consciousness is marked, the first reflection. And he also claims, following Freud, that the only thing that doesn't lie, the only emotion or feeling that doesn't lie, is the feeling of anxiety. It tells the truth. It's not like happiness is something we react on, the way we react on the good stuff, and anxiety we react on the bad stuff. But there's something that doesn't like when you see truth. You're horrified. You react with anxiety. But what Zizek doesn't consider, and the other source that I was not necessary to read for today, but I really want you to read for the next time, is Zapffe, my favorite philosopher. So because Zapffe, this kind of link even to Freud, link to Feuerbach, and link to whoever else, and Hegel, Night of the World, is kind of artificial here. And even Damasio, you need to put some thought on it to see it from such a perspective. The person who provides like this, you don't need to put additional thinking to it. It's obviously present in him, is Zapffe, because he claimed that our consciousness is a biological paradox, and it's painful by nature. So it's not only painful by nature, but it is pain. It is pain, error, and mistake. And so it's this emptiness, whatever the reason. You will elaborate why is it so. And so he preserved this logic that at the beginning it's a kind of a mistake, stuff like that. And we actually survive as human beings. We survive because we have some defense mechanism against this truth, against this pain of exaggerated consciousness, this glitch. Some of the defense mechanisms are isolation. So we are capable to survive because we are repressing this destructive thoughts. We try not to think about it. We escape in this truth, this pain, or concentrating on something that is more bearable, and some illusions. The second one is anchoring. So anchoring is creating of higher meanings and ideals. And this includes everything which is valuable for us, which we find as a reason to live, like God, church, well, not us, but maybe. And it even includes our values: morality, faith, the law of life, the people, the future, the love, everything. It's just anchoring, the invention of some values that helps us to go on. And sublimation, his favorite one, because he's philosopher. He claims that we, not sublimation in Freudian sense, because for Freud, still the idea of sublimation, that initial drives is sexual and is pleasure principle, and it's impossible to fully satisfy it within the culture. So we need to sublimate this pleasure thing, drive to pleasure, by doing some more culturally acceptable stuff. Here is a sublimation of this initial pain. It's a real death drive idea that is at the basis here. So, and we trying to sublimate it, for example, in philosophy, in art, and this he claims is the best way. But the logic here is that those are not, those are only way we escape from the pain of our exaggerated consciousness, from this glitch and painful experience. And there is no other way to exist, right? Because once we fully coincide with the truth of us, with this rupture, we just die. It's unbearable. We feel an anxiety. We don't want to live. There is no meaning of life. And so to persist, we need to figure out the way those illusions, and it's actually, Zapffe claims that it's social contract, that we need to believe those things to be part of society. We can, like, all the people keep this secret without, not allowed to tell each other that love doesn't exist, and that even philosophy is just a way of sublimating something, transforming. so this the social contract, invisible one, is that we are supposed to lie to each other, and there is no way to change it, otherwise all of us will get destroyed. And initially the name of this lecture is supposed to be on some postmodernist stuff, and it's kind of easy to connect Zapffe with postmodernism. And if you remember, we were reading Sorensen, the idea on his research work on modern suffering, that actually everything seems just fine, or more or less fine, when not now, but it used to be better. And so nonetheless, the circumstances of our lives are not that bad, but we still suffer more. And one of the reasons is that we don't believe we are too clever, so consciousness is evolving all the time, right? And maybe one day we won't be able to do all of the stuff, and we actually will not survive because this mistake will be too visible. So I think that people, postmodern people who don't believe anymore in meanings, and who discover, who can't believe in God, for example, they just can't, and they suffer. So they more coincide with who they are, and or we can perceive it as a matter of more exaggerated consciousness. Okay, that's all for today. And do you have any questions? We have 2 minutes. Don't see you.
You said that there is a social contract and it's that we're supposed to lie to each other, saying that love, happiness, and etc. exists, right?
Yeah.
And is nowadays our contemporary society somehow better than that, because we are supposed to say to tell to each other that love doesn't exist, and there is no happiness in this world, their whole life is suffering, and all the kind of stuff, not only in contemporary psychoanalysis, but also we can see this a lot online on the internet and stuff.
Yeah, and maybe because now it's impossible to, because the information is circulating better. For example, now we know that it's impossible to preserve the illusion that people are not cheating within the pairs, something like that. So if we want, it used to be possible to preserve it. And we know that Sartre's main principle was that you can have many women, but the crucial rule is to lie. So he did actually lie to Simone Beauvoir, which is of course terrible thing. But you know, and the love is something that you need to focus on the good side and actually don't see the structurally bad side of it. And because we now recognize it, and because of the information circulating better, it's kind of harder to not to recognize, and not to concentrate on the full part of the glass water, but also see the bad side of it. And the worst thing is not that there is an empty part of the glass of water, but there is always both, this part and this part. Okay, let's have a 10 minutes break, and then we will try to have the Angelina's presentation, right? I'll just switch the camera on and I'll mute myself. I'll go away for 10 minutes, but then you come back to help Angelina with her presentation. I'll stop recording too. I see you in 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.